Next, we'll go over to Guy, Engineering Manager at SumUp. And again, any questions throughout, please keep putting them into the Q&A for after this presentation.
Awesome. So, hello, my name is Guilherme, or feel free to call me Guy. I'm an engineering manager at SumUp, and today I'll be talking about the things that I've learned along the way that end up making my life easier and things that I don't need to think this much to decide. But to talk about this, let me go back to the first steps that I had to take when I started my career. I started my career in Rio. I'm Brazilian, by the way. And yes, that's a picture of my city. That's the place where I used to go most of my weekends. So I started my career at Globo. Globo is the biggest media company in Brazil, and the company does exist since 1965. So it's a really old company. And at the time, we had a whole team focused solely on infrastructure. They were sysadmins, and we had a support team 24/7, and we had all the metrics that we needed related to our services. So we didn't have to worry this much about if a service was misbehaving. We had some people taking care of this for us. And this was extremely interesting because I barely remember any time where I actually needed to involve development teams to actually debug a service. They were able to handle this quite well on the sysadmin layer. And we also had some open source projects like THUMBOR and THUMBOR. Like Yuri mentioned on his presentation that if you can buy something on the outside, you should not build yourself. At the time, because of the volume and the prerequisites that we had at Global, we could not buy something that would do what we needed to get from these services. And that's something that you need to consider when you're creating an open source project, that you need to make sure that that's part of our team's goal to maintain an open source project, because it's not something that you just drop on the community and it would pick up traction. You need to work on it. But we can talk about this later. Inside the company, at some point we had something around 20 development teams to a single infrastructure team. So at some point they started to become a bottleneck for the whole company. So they decided to move to Puppet to allow the development teams to provision their own instances to create their machines. And let's remember that this was before Docker was mainstream, before Kubernetes was a thing. And Global has a volume that we could not use AWS. So Global has its own data centers and actually has its own data center. It built a data center just for the company. So this whole movement to Puppet allowed us to kind of jump into this whole DevOps movement. I started as a developer. So the thing is, how can I allow my team to create something that would be usable by the infrastructure team? And at the time we had these issues that if you have one deployment happening on a Monday and you have a deployment happening on Friday and there are new instances, sometimes the versions would differ. It was hard to have these immutable deployments throughout time. So we came up with this solution using Puppet and some Jenkins magic. So we had our Ruby service. We had our Ruby service, would create a new tag. Jenkins would pick up this tag, run some unit and functional integration tests. Then it would create a virtual machine with the same image that we're using in production, run the same Puppet scripts that we had that would deploy our instance and provision our whole instance in production. We would run some smoke tests on it, and that's it. If everything's okay, our service is ready to be deployed to production. This was a way that we could cope with these immutable deployments. Something that with Docker, it's easy to achieve, but before Docker, it was a little bit harder to do without some pinning of versions and some things that I had to do that would make it even harder for you to update dependencies. Then we had this open source project called THUMBOR. Globo had a specific thing. We were a media company, and our website relied a lot on images. And as you can see on the left side, that's the main portal of Globo. You have a lot of different sizes, and it was not uncommon for developers to decide to increase, I don't know, the width by 2 pixels or the height by 3 pixels. And before THUMBOR, this would force us to go through all images that we had and regenerate the thumbnails for these images. And at some point, we had so many images that it would take almost a day or two to regenerate all the images. And this was actually reducing the amount of changes that we could do on our portal. So we came up with this project. This would generate image thumbnails on the fly. And as I said, we needed to have the whole team focus on this to maintain the community and to maintain the project. So it was a conscious decision to make this an open source project. And we got the benefit from it. At some point, Square decided to start using the project. And they redid almost all the cryptography algorithms that we had on the project to fit their need. At some point, Fox Media started using too. So they implemented some plugins to generate a GIF into a MP4 file. But we needed to make sure that this was part of the team goal. Every time you create an open source project, think if you're doing this out of necessity or if you're just creating this for your own ego, and if you actually have the time to maintain the community and the project. In this case, we had a real problem and we were able to solve it through this project. The project is still alive, it's still maintained, the community has grown a lot. And now most of the contributions, they come from the outside, not only from Globo. Then after 7 years on the same company, I decided to move to São Paulo. I don't know, I wanted to try something new and I went to smaller companies. One of them was Educar and then TFG. This was a game company at the time. And there I found out how much you can change in a company as a single person. It's incredible the blast radius as a single person has in a smaller environment. This was incredible because we could experiment with so many different things. At some point, we decided to create a chat service using Elixir and MQTT just to try how this would behave on our games. But there was no infrastructure team anymore. We didn't have this safety net for us. And at some point during a game release, we had an outage and there were no metrics to back us up. We felt like we were shooting in the dark, trying to figure out what was the issue. And we learned the hard way what happens when you don't have the proper observability of your services. So what we did what any smart person would do. We purchased our way into observability. We made a contract with DATADOG. We got all their dashboards. We got everything that they had to help us have this visibility of our services, our infrastructure, everything that we had running at the time. And just to mention the outage that we had, we figured out what was the issue after. We had, for every request on the service, we were creating a database transaction, even if we didn't have to go to the database. And well, looking back now, it seems obvious, but when you're during an outage, it's hard to have a clear mind. Then changing cities was not scary enough. I decided to change countries. So I moved to Berlin. I've been living here for the past 3 years. And as soon as I got here, as soon as I joined NEWSTORE, the first thing that I noticed was the amount of effort that people would put into writing things down to make sure that everybody from the team to the other teams involved, that everything that was decided was clear to them. So everything was written down, and that actually helps a lot now during the pandemic, because I don't want to be that company that have a single person that has been with the company for the past 20 years and actually have to consult them for every past decision that a company has made. It's good to have this written down everywhere. And comparing this to the other companies, the refinement process of tasks, everything was way more concise, and this was something that we forced ourselves to do, to find out how and why we were doing things. And one thing that helps is that both NEWSTORE and SumUp, they have offices in Brazil, Berlin, US. Writing down decisions does help to communicate. But on NEWSTORE, we had one specific problem. The platform was a bunch of microservices. At some point, we were joking that those are not microservices, those were nano-services. It was more than 75 services that you needed to run locally to be able to develop on the platform. And just imagine you as a developer having to run 75 Docker containers to be able to develop something. Our lead time was not development. Our lead time was people waiting for the platform to boot up on their local machines to be able to develop. And here, I'm not going to discuss why it was like this, but we needed to allow people to develop fast so we could break out of this nano services that we had. And even for QAs to test it, they needed to run this locally. They needed to have local access to the master branch of our platform. So we came up with a plan to do this. We created a remote Kubernetes cluster that would run the whole platform. So you would not need to run this locally. This would offload all the processing power that you needed from your machine to the cloud, to our Kubernetes cluster. But people would still need to develop some services locally. So we would reduce this to only a handful of services that you needed to run locally to develop. So the thing was, we had a CLI at the time, so we would just type NEWSTORE up. It would bring up your own platform on a Kubernetes cluster, isolated on a single namespace. Then you start telepresence proxy. This would proxy all the requests from the same space to your local machine as if it was running locally. Then telepresence allows you to start some services locally, mimicking the whole environment that you'd have on this remote cluster. So you could develop locally as if you were developing on this remote cluster. You could do changes, save, restart, and since you're running only one or two services, it would be blazing fast. This was the best solution that we could come up with at the time to allow the development cycle to be shorter. And then on SumUp, we had another issue. On SumUp, what we're doing is that we're starting to break down our single account into multiple accounts, into multiple environments, to allow teams to have this, to be isolated and to make their own decisions about how they want to run their services. But we have a single agreement. We do have this Prometheus layer that we use to monitor all our services. And at the time, we had this Prometheus running, for instance, on our live cluster, and it was a single instance, and it would go down from time to time. So we needed to make sure that our observability layer was highly available. And all the services were already implemented Prometheus interfaces. So we decided to go with Thanos to make sure that we had this highly available throughout the environments. So what do we do with Thanos? Thanos is a component on top of Prometheus that allows you to store the metrics on S3, and you can have a central place, all highly available. you have a central place that you can query for metrics on Grafana, and you can have each of these environments communicating to an alert manager to send you alerts on every metric. And that's the key thing here, to make sure that you have observability on your service. As I mentioned in São Paulo when I was working for TFG, you don't want to be on an outage without metrics. It's something that I never want to be having again, never. And well, the S3 bucket that we use costs us, I think, $200 per month. So it's quite cheap to store all the metrics that we have per month. Then those were the lessons learned, just to recap. On SumUp, what we do is that we try our best to create the metrics when we're developing the service. So we've managed to patch together the dashboard creation, the metrics, and the alerts. So we think as part of the service development, what are the metrics that we want to have, or our failure metrics, what are success metrics, and we have together with the service the dashboards. So when you sync the deployment, we currently use Prometheus operator for this, and it allows us to have on the service both the dashboard, the Prometheus rules, the alerts that we want to have, and any other rules that we want to have, and the service monitors. As I mentioned at Globo, make sure that you do test your infrastructure code. We have this whole movement going to infrastructure as code. And the main benefit that you can have from this is that the testability that this gives you. Before you have to provision an instance and test it. Right now, what you can do is that you can use a set of frameworks that will allow you to have some predictability if your scripts are going to work or not. You can use TerraTest for Terraform, you can use Inspec, you can use Molecule for Ansible. Just make sure you do it. Try the best you can to reduce the development cycle on your infrastructure. Try your best to write playbooks. Playbooks, they work well for us because when something happens, you want to have this step-by-step recipe that you follow to solve the problem. You don't want to be during an outage without a clear mind. Imagine you wake up at 3 a.m., you need to figure out everything that's happening and then to start solving this. If you have a playbook, you just have the person repeating all the steps and improving the whole on-call process. And what we do on SumUp now is that as soon as we send the alert, we already send the playbook link. So the person just has to click on it, fix it, and evaluate if it's fixed. Then during a pandemic, that became quite important for us. Write down every decision you make. It will be impossible for you to remember 6 months from now why you decided something. And if you want people to be involved on your project, if you have written down decisions, they can take their time and read through it. On TFG, I learned the hard way. Make sure that you have an on-call rotation. And why you should have this? If you don't have an on-call rotation, you're always on call. You're not sure who is going to take the alert if something happens. Make sure that always have somebody taking care of this so everybody else could sleep better. And about the open source project, when you decide to do it, document it well and test it. If you want people to contribute, the test would make sure that they understand the decision and they will be more comfortable contributing to your project. Take the time to discuss the project. That's extremely important. You want to take things out of your head and go back and forth with people to fully understand why you're doing something and how you're doing this. And if you want to actually solve problems, and as Yair mentioned on his presentation, failure is the best way for you to learn something. So do a postmortem out of your failures. Try to understand why things failed and how you can improve the process to make it better. And there's something that I didn't put here, but be nice to people. That's a good thing that you can do. That's it. We're hiring at SumUp, so if you want to work with us, just click on the link of the presentation, or you can follow me on GitHub. If you follow me on Twitter, you're just gonna get all political. So just follow if you're ready for this. And thank you.
Be nice to people, I think goes a nice ending to that. But yeah, really interesting to hear the different behaviors and tools you've used over the years, the mistakes and then the learns from it. I think that will be really insightful and helpful to the group. Right, there's a few questions for the group. I think we'll give a question for Guy here, again anonymous, but who is responsible for automation testing, in brackets, business scenarios that need to be tested, not the unit test? Is it a QA team or the DevOps team? Who writes the automation scripts and maintains them?
So at the time, it would depend on the company. At Globo, since we're following Scrum, we had a team that was mainly made out of backend, front-end engineers, QAs, and infrastructure. So at the time, we had the QA working with the product manager to define the business metrics that we wanted to test it. Then on other companies, what we do have is the developers writing down with the product managers to decide how we want to test things and how we want to ensure success. And it's not about only testing, as mentioned. It's not unit tests, functional tests, or integration tests. It's testing if it's a success or a failure. So the biggest impact that you can make is in observability. It doesn't matter if you develop something and you have no idea if it's a success or not. You need to have observability. That's the most important thing of any service that you can imagine, any platform. If you don't have any observability or a way to get feedback, you have no idea if it's a success or a failure.
Right, we now have a question for the three of you. So common thread between all seems to be culture and community. What does that actually mean to you? What does it look like? And 3 things you do to create it. That's a question from Susan.
One thing that I like to mention is that if you look at companies before, and that happened a lot, it was always DevOps against developers against sysadmins. Sysadmins would like to keep the system running. So if you change the system, you might break it. So they want to keep it as static as possible. All developers, they need to change the system to deliver value. So this whole sense of community is to create a bridge between what is important for sysadmins and what is important for developers. So the company as a whole could deliver value with something that is important for both sysadmins and developers. So that's when you have a DevOps. When you have a role of a DevOps, you have a person that would have a foot on each country.
Close that one off. So 2 questions left. This one again out to the group from anonymous. When you come in and take on a new company, team, or project, what do you look at first to really get what's going on with their DevOps? What are your go-to things you put in place to make the biggest impact?
Yeah, I do think that the first thing that I do look for is an architecture diagram to try and understand what is going on with the team and what are they responsible for. Then after you understand what they're responsible for, then I go talk to the stakeholders, the people that actually use their systems or their services, anything that they're actually touching. And then I look for the automation that they have, because the automation does tell a lot about the maturity of the project. how confident they are about deployments, if they actually do deployments. Those are the things that I look for. And then I look for the metrics. If there are no metrics, please introduce them. It is the best thing you can do.
Okay. Visibility, I think, as you said, from your previous employer in Sao Paulo seems incredibly important to you now, so you can understand, what's happened and if there are any problems.